So with the playoff matchups being final now for the NFL, I just wanted to go ahead and give my predictions for the first round. So going in order of the game, starting with Denver at Buffalo, I think this is going to be pretty much a blowout. I think all signs really lead to Buffalo taking this game. I think it'll be a high-scoring game for Buffalo, even though Denver has shown that their defense has been one of their strong suits this year. I just don't think they've been playing to the same level that they have in the beginning of the season. And I think the Bills have really put a lot of points on the board, so I think they're just going to continue to do that there. And then going to the Steelers in Baltimore, I think the Ravens should also take this pretty easily. I think earlier in the season, you do have the Steelers beating the Ravens, but I think this game is going to play out a lot more similar to when they played the second time. And I think the Ravens have been a little bit inconsistent this year, but overall, I think they do look pretty sharp and are just really looking explosive offensively. I think even though their defense hasn't played to what it has in the past, I do think that their offense, along with Derrick Henry, has really taken everything to the next level, and I do think that the Steelers have looked pretty flat in their last few games. So I think the Ravens should pull out a pretty comfortable win there. And then going to the Chargers in Houston, I think this is going to be a lot closer of a game in terms of the AFC matchups that we're getting so far. But I do think the thing that stands out to me is having the Chargers having one of the best defenses in the league, and I think the Texans aren't nearly where they should be, and I think a lot of this can be amounted to injuries such as Diggs and Dell. But I think it'll be a lot of back and forth. I do think you're going to have a pretty good quarterback matchup and a pretty good coaching duel. But just given what we got over the course of the season, I think the Texans maybe fell a little bit short than where they were predicted to be at the beginning of the season. And I think the Chargers have really turned it around in terms of their program so far. So I do think that the Chargers are going to edge it out. And then going to the NFC, starting with the Packers at Philadelphia. I do think this is going to be a semi-close game, but I really think it's hard to bet against Philadelphia, especially with Saquon Barkley. And I think even their recent loss to the Commanders has to be taken with a grain of salt because you do have Jalen Hurts coming out with a concussion pretty early on in the game. And then I think one of the more underrated things of Philadelphia is their defense being one of the best in the league this year. And I think they've had a really complete turnaround in terms of where their defense was at last year at this time. But I do think that the Packers are a really good team. But matching up against Philadelphia, I think they're just a little bit lesser version of what the Eagles are at this year. And I think pretty much in every capacity, Philadelphia is just a little bit better. But I do think there could be a lot of back and forth in this game, but I do think that the Eagles are going to pull away here. And then going into another interesting matchup, the Commanders going to Tampa Bay to play the Buccaneers. I do think this is going to be one of the closer games along with the Chargers and the Texans. And I think this is one of the harder games to predict. I do like what the Commanders have done this year. I do think that Jaden Daniels is the best rookie quarterback by far and is definitely in the top conversation for maybe top 5 quarterbacks this year. But you also got to give it to Baker Mayfield, who's really had a great season within itself. But I do think that Tampa Bay has struggled with injuries, even being without both Evans and then Godwin, who's looking to also probably not going to continue to play the rest of this year, including the playoffs. But I do think that the Buccaneers are in a much better place than being without both of them. And even though the Commanders have the much better record, I just think that the Buccaneers have turned in a little bit better of a resume. Again, going back to the win against Philadelphia, I do think that has to be taken with a grain of salt. And you look at the 5 turnovers that the Commanders have had Jalen Hurts been healthy for the entire game, I think the Eagles would have capitalized a lot more in terms of those turnovers. So I think looking at who the Commanders have beat, it's really not as impressive, but their record has really shown to be strong this year. And I do think that Tampa Bay has proven to beat the better teams, even though their record shows otherwise. And you have to go back to the beginning of the year where the Buccaneers did beat the Commanders at home. And then you also have the Buccaneers beating the Lions and the Eagles, for example, and even taking the Chiefs into overtime. So I think if it comes down to it, I do like the Buccaneers' chances in this. And then going into the Monday game, this comes just following the loss to the Detroit Lions. You do have the Minnesota Vikings traveling to LA to play the Rams. And I think the Vikings, obviously, if they won, would have been in a much better place for the playoffs along with that first round bye. And I really do think they're in a little bit of a bind, now going to have to turn it around after what looked to be almost a playoff game being the last game of the season itself. And really kind of being more tired and fatigued after a hard-fought loss, whereas the Rams pretty much rested in their last game. I do think that would heavily benefit the Rams, but just looking at how the Vikings have played this year, I really think it has been an impressive season for them. I think their defense has really looked great. I think their coaching on both sides of the ball has looked great. I do think you have a great turnaround year from Sam Darnold and just so many offensive weapons from Jefferson to Jones and even getting Hawkinson back. But I just think in terms of momentum, it's going to be really hard to go from not just a loss, but pretty much a blowout game against the Lions to now trying to compete in a playoff game when you could have easily had a bye. I think the mental fatigue of that is going to be hard for Minnesota. But I do think the Rams have had a lot more of an inconsistent season in comparison to the Vikings. But I do think that a lot of this has to be attributed to injuries. You do have Puka Nacua and Cooper Kupp being hurt for about half the year in the middle of the season. And I think if that had not happened, or if maybe they would have just lost one or the other, maybe the Rams would be just a few more games ahead of where they are. I do think the Rams have shown a lot more potential in terms of who they've beaten, and this would include the Bills, along with beating the Vikings. A lot of their quick passes is a pretty tough matchup for Minnesota's defense, and I do like how they can sneak in runs with Kyren Williams. And I think Matthew Stafford, for being 36, really does move fairly well. So I do think this is going to be a tough game to call, but I probably would give the edge to the Rams, just looking at how uncompetitive the Vikings looked against the Lions and just looking at how the Rams have really pulled it together towards the end of the season. So that would be my 6 picks for the first round of the NFL playoffs for this year, and I'll see you later.